High Bridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Road Bends by Sami Yaffa with Tommi Liimatta, read by Sami Yaffa. 1963 to 1979, from Tapiola to Lepakko. Playing music puts you in this state of being that's a really good place to be in. In a way, you're not yourself. You're not necessarily totally conscious of what your fingers are doing. 1963 to 1969. Grandpa's harmonica and honky-tonk women. A bus. That's my earliest memory. Also, the very first words I ever uttered were, a bus. I was sitting in my stroller on a sunny afternoon, when everyone around me was buzzing like mad because I'd said something intelligible. Little did I know then that I would end up spending the rest of my life in buses. I was born in the Helsinki Women's Clinic on September the 4th, 1963, at 12:15 a.m. From there, I was whisked off to the Tapiola neighborhood of Espoo, Kelohongantie 14F32, to grow up and live for the next 16 years. My parents, Ingrid and Lori, or Lasse, sister Marit and brother Jouni, made up the family. The garden city of Tapiola was designed as the suburb of the future, a model design city that architects and tourists from around the world would come to visit and marvel at. The street I lived on, Kelohongantie, sloped up from the Oravanahkatori, Squirrel Skin Square, in English, miniature strip mall. Our building had 3 stories and 7 stairwells from A to G. The so-called Taskumatti buildings were right next door. The whole area was built in harmony with nature, with lots of wooded areas to run around in. In the late 60s, the neighboring town of Mankka was totally rural, just dirt roads, forest and fields. We'd buy our vegetables straight from the farmers. My first memory of my dad is him in a welding helmet, crazily spraying paint from a can in each hand, giving birth to an abstract painting on a large canvas. I was sitting in my mom's lap in the basement studio, wearing an Abraham Lincoln top hat that Dad had made me out of black cardboard. I remember wishing that things could always be like this. Dad was born poor in 1930 in the Pohjanmaa region of Finland, famous for his knife-wielding outlaw gangs at the turn of the century. His mother died when he was 4. His father was crushed by the death of his wife and took to the bottle. He couldn't take care of his child. Dad was brought to a farm, where he labored as a child and was brought up by a strict religious matriarch. He was not allowed to sleep in the main house but in the barn. At 16, in 1946, he moved to Helsinki, which was a pretty brutal place to be right after the war, full of ruins and broken people. Dad got a job working the lathe in a machine shop, did all kinds of odd jobs, and managed to go to art school at night. Easy to say that Pops didn't take to whining too kindly. Throughout the 50s, Dad worked as an assistant to somewhat legendary designer Timo Sarpaneva and designed ad campaigns for Iittala Glass. Dad also made sculptures and painted until he started a family and had to earn a better living. He continued to paint until his death, never showing his works publicly. Later on, he worked at the Taucher advertising firm as a graphic designer and as an artistic director at the international agency Interplan. Dad's fingerprints can be found all over, like on the World Chess Federation logo, the one Bobby Fischer and Anatoly Karpov played under. Toward the end of his career, Dad scaled down to just one client, a Finnish paper-producing giant, Finnpap, which was enough. He did all of Finnpap's campaigns. He got me a modeling job in a Serlachius toilet paper ad. Mom brought me to the shoot. I was really young, maybe 3. The studio had bright lights and a set with a strange woman sitting on the couch, who was supposed to play my mom in the ad. I didn't want to go near her, because I thought my real mom should have been on the couch. I'm not going to do this. This is some other mom. I wasn't feeling it. Somehow they enticed me to do the job, probably with some candy. That was my first commercial gig. There was an animation studio down the street from our apartment that I'd often go to. I'd sit quietly in the dark and watch the figures grow from black and white sketches to moving in full color. It was pure magic. The second best place in the world was the bakery downstairs from the production company, where you could get soda, meat pies, and donuts. My mom's mom, Ingeborg Hogene, was from Fagernes in western Norway, not far from the glaciers of Jotunheimen, the land of the giants in Viking legends. I was told we're descendants of Harald Fairhair, but who knows? At 18, Ingeborg went to Finland as a maid to a wealthy Norwegian couple and fell in love with Emil Kesäluoto, 10 years her senior. Grandma was gentle, strong, and understanding, whereas Grandpa was a train conductor who excelled in sports and played the violin and harmonica with a taste for gambling. Mom lived through the Soviet bombings in Helsinki. After things with the Russians got too heavy, Grandpa evacuated her off to Norway with her mom to flee the war. But they had to do a quick turnaround and head back to Finland when the Nazis invaded Norway. We'd go to Grandma's apartment in Hiekkahari on the local train. Grandpa would show up down the train hallway in a blue conductor's uniform, hat and a cool coin belt. He would give me some used train tickets, which I used to play games with other kids. When I think of Grandpa, I remember a green rocking chair, his warm presence, big hands, and the soothing sound of the harmonica. Grandpa's harmonica is probably my first musical memory, but the Rolling Stones' Honky Tonk Women was the first big one that hit me upside the head. I was 5. It was definitely love at first sound when I heard it on my brother's turntable. Jone, 8 years my senior, and his friends had built me a little guitar and beautifully carved the names Rolling Stones, Monkees, and Manfred Mann on it. I strummed the guitar endlessly and dreamed of having Jimi Hendrix's hair. We had a pretty sick record collection at home of all the heavyweights. Janis Joplin, Memphis Slim, John Coltrane, Stones, Zappa, etc. Dad listened to Django Reinhardt and Ornette Coleman, Mom to Demis Roussos and classical music. My brother and sister were heavy into the late 60s rock and roll, but already starting to lean towards jazz. My head was filled with all that good stuff from a very young age. I remember watching the 1968 Finnish presidential elections on TV. The Cold War was in full effect. Reading the votes out loud left 4-year-old me with the impression that there was no other candidate but Kekkonen, 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 Kekkonen. That one name dominated the others and got stuck like a mantra in your head. The U.S. sent Apollo 11 to the moon in the last summer of the decade, and the TV showed Neil Armstrong and the other astronauts leaping around on the moon. The waving American flag made me wonder, wow, there's wind on the moon too? And of course, being Yanks, they had to drag a car to the moon. 1970 to 1974. Are there any dull knives in the house? The name Pelé was heard a lot in the summer of 1970, when Brazil won the Soccer Football World Cup in Mexico City. I'd jump out of bed in the morning, pull on my swim trunks, and go run to the yard to practice my scissor kick endlessly. Of course my jersey had to be number 10, same as Pelé. Every building in my neighborhood had its own little gang or clique. We jumped from trees, scrambled up the rocks, and played Rock War using the old First World War trenches behind Kino Tapiola movie theater as our battlefield. Sometimes things got a little out of hand and someone got knocked in the head by a rock, but usually things were pretty harmonious. Sometimes we'd pedal to a bar in Oravanakkatori to bum some free chocolate milkshakes. The Tapiola power plant's giant smokestack was right in my backyard, which sent black exhaust up into the sky. Big green oil trucks delivered heating oil all day long to feed the gaping maw of the plant. I'd watch the smoke curl up to the sky and think about what kind of toxic shit was in it. It sure as hell couldn't be healthy. Haukilahti Beach was a bike ride away. At that time, Haukilahti was a pretty fancy place even if Kisse Häkkinen, the bass player from the Hurricanes, lived there. Kisse was the biggest celebrity living in the Tapiola region. Jaana Ukkola, who later became a model and owner of a modeling agency, was one of our neighbors. Jaana's mom, Eila Iiris, hired me to model a couple of times. When I was 7, I modeled some underwear for a women's magazine, Kotiliesi. I wore long johns, briefs, an orange boiler suit, and manly stockings with a reinforced foot. The legendary Heksi Riihiranta lived a few hundred yards from us. He played defense for the HIFK hockey team. He and Vellu Ketola were the first Finns to play in the NHL, which was a big deal. When my sister got caught smoking weed at 13 and needed a lawyer, it ended up being another hockey player, Juha Rantasila, one of Finland's best-known defensive players. The older guys of Kelohongantie chopped up old Javas, Motor Guzzis, and Nortons in front of the bike shed. One guy tuned a Tunturi moped to rocket 60 miles an hour and got so hurt in a fall that his leg had to be shortened a couple of inches. There were 2 old American cars in the yard, too. The Kansi family had a blue Thunderbird, and Kelty, the taxi driver, had a Plymouth. There's a picture where I'm sitting in Kelty's Plymouth dressed as Batman. Kelty was sometimes found passed out under our stairwell even though he lived 4 doors down. Must have been a rough day at work. Us kids were freaked out wondering if he was dead. An old lady from the building went to shake him and figured out what was going on. "A lot of nerve you got to pass out drunk in front of all the kids in the middle of the day. Get moving!" Watching the TV news on one of the 2 TV channels was the evening ritual in every family. Foreign Minister Ahti Karjalainen droned on in his slow and incomprehensible English, making everybody ashamed, but also providing comedy with his heavy Finnish accent. Henry Kissinger mumbled in that creepy robot voice about the necessity of war, because if the United States didn't continue to arm up and fight, the communists would take over the world. Americans seemed to be real worked up about communism. Vietnam was the first televised war. Every night, I'd watch carpet bombings and unbelievable suffering until my mom shooed me away from the TV. Dirty and ragged American soldiers plodded through the rice fields, hand-rolled cigarettes dangling from slack jaws. The jungles exploded into giant napalm flame balls. The Vietnamese peasants fled burned and naked on muddy roads. Dad paced angrily back and forth in front of the TV, cursing. Fucking Americans. Goddamn Nixon. In a little kid's brain, this all left the impression of a world in complete chaos. It seemed like the old was giving way to the new. There was rioting in the cities around the world. Hippies and Black Panthers challenging the status quo. No justice, no peace. Change in human societies doesn't happen often without chaos and destruction. There was a war on the home front as well, and this one was between Mom and Dad. Doors were slammed and furniture got smashed. Sometimes we'd end up fleeing to Grandma's in the middle of the night because of the fights. Lots of nights I went to sleep with my head under the pillow to drown out the dismal soundtrack while my brother tried to calm me down. There was fighting at home. On the TV was the Vietnam War, and it was all set to the music of Miles Davis, Rolling Stones, The Doors, and especially Jimi Hendrix's Machine Gun. It was all so heavy. We had that iconic Che Guevara poster on our wall next to Herman's Hermits and Hendrix. I started school the fall that Hendrix died. I remember when the news hit. It hit my brother and sister hard. Brian Jones had died a year before, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison. It felt like they all died at the same time. The neighborhood was full of families, and everyone ate at home. Back then, no one ate at restaurants, because there weren't that many and they were expensive. Kitchen knives were like treasures. We had a couple of good ones. Mom always used the same one for cooking. When the knives got dull, they needed to be sharpened. A knife sharpener used to come by, door to door, to fix the knives. You could hear him in the hallway. "Are there any dull knives in the house?" This guy had an absolutely legendary look, straight out of a French gangster film. Cigarette butt dangling from his mouth, a crumpled fedora pushed far back on his head, a faded brown suit, and the wide sharpening strap slung over his shoulder. He stank of sweat, stale booze, and garlic. He was terrifying, almost like bringing the horrors of the war in Vietnam to the front door. One day I needed to go out when he was doing his thing, but didn't dare to do so. After some procrastinating, I figured out that I could just run by him like a maniac. And I did. It worked. One time when I spurted past him, the knife sharpener stopped me and grabbed me by the arm. My heart blocked my throat. This was the end. I'm gonna die. But once I looked into his kind brown eyes, I realized that he was probably a pretty okay guy after all. He muttered, "Calm down, kid. I ain't gonna kill you." My fear of the knife sharpener vanished that day. There's a guy driving around Brooklyn to this day whose family has been sharpening knives since the beginning of the 20th century. He comes around in an old truck with 3 pit bulls in the back with all his sharpening gear. He also has his own jingle, so that everybody knows to bring their knives downstairs. He doesn't do it for the money. He has another means of making a living, but makes the rounds a couple times a month for the fun of it and to keep the tradition alive. The tradition will be gone after he's gone, or when he decides to quit. In the summertime, Dad and I would spend a couple of weeks camping on the island of Gåsgrund. We'd fish, eat canned food, drink water from the well. A supply boat would come by every 4 days or so to sell food and necessities. My dream was to one day be the captain of that boat. Days on the island went by fast, running around, inspecting the island, looking at birds, fishing, carving wood, and floating on an air mattress in the freezing cold Baltic summer sea. In the winter, Grandma stitched me a military-like snowsuit. I wrestled myself into it and went out into the woods to practice my defense tactics with a toy machine gun, in case Russia invaded again or the craziness on TV made its way to Tapiola. Playing war as kids was a big thing. The huge stones in the forest around our house all had names, some after mythological forest beings and animals, like Hiidenkivi and Otsonkivi, or just because the rock looked like the letter A, Aakkoskivi. One time I was going to play hockey and was running downhill in the woods, skates around my neck and a hockey stick in hand. Toward the bottom, the path had a blind turn behind another one of these massive boulders. I turned the corner and ran right into a moose's muzzle. I just about pissed my pants. I bolted right back up to where I came from. The path felt like it had gone vertical, and I felt the enraged moose on my tail, foaming at the mouth. Once I got to the top of the hill, I realized the beast hadn't been following me at all. Just as scared of me, it had boogied off full speed the other way across the road. A different sort of people lived in a shack town called Viinamäki, Booze Hill in English, down the hill from our neighborhood. The drunks' dwellings were only slightly better than our homemade huts, made out of discarded planks of wood and cardboard. Viinamäki was less than a half a mile from the center of Tapiola, right next to the hockey and soccer fields. You had to tread carefully in the forest if you didn't want to run into the winos. Whoever was brave enough to sneak into the camp while the drunks were snoring away to gather bottles for the deposit money was a true hero. One morning I crept up to the outskirts of the shanty town, peeking out from behind a rock from a distance to see if anyone was awake. They were definitely awake. Viinamäki was having a full-on party. The drunks were sitting in a circle on rocks and boxes, shouting, clapping, singing, and passing bottles around. In the center of the circle, an old couple, beaten up by life, were rocking back and forth on top of each other in time with the applause. What the fuck were they doing? Then I realized those two old winos were getting it on. It was a pretty grim visual. That image would come back to me later while reading Bukowski. The contrast was pretty jarring. Behind the well-manicured lawns and nice houses was a forest where a debauched group of forgotten people, the homeless alcoholics, many of them veterans from the Second World War, were getting wasted and living in misery. We'd go play the slot machines and pinball in the bakery with the money we'd get from the bottle deposits. If we won money from the slot machines, we'd go to Dipoli in Otaniemi to play pool. Viinamäki was torn down when the city built a jogging track in the forest. The poor bastards had to move elsewhere. Some of them probably ended up in the flop house in Ruoholahti that later became Lepakkoluola. Because of Dad's advertising work, our house was full of all kinds of paper, pens, rulers, markers, brushes, and paints. I drew whenever I could, wherever I could, on my school books, fences, bus stops, my hands, and a lot on paper. I drew caricatures of my friends and family, magical beings, ghosts, nature, war, sports, dictators, politicians. Sometimes I tried to copy Picasso. On the weekends, my parents dragged me to the Atheneum Art Museum and other galleries in central Helsinki to check out the abstract art that was happening in the late 60s and early 70s. Art shows, museums, and galleries were a dream world that stick with me for the rest of my life. I got it in my head to look for treasure. I started examining rocks with a little pick and hammer, taking little samples to the geology lab, which was a bike ride away. I wanted to know what my findings were and what kind of rocks and stones existed in my area. The guy at the lab was patient and helpful. He'd tell me what kinds of rocks I'd brought and gave me a box of samples and explanations of different types of rocks so I could compare my findings against those. I kept on chipping away, and more rocks fell into my bag. If the shards were even a little bit unusual, like a freshly cracked surface of rock that shone like gemstone, I'd put it in my bag and haul it in for inspection. It became a thing in the lab. Here comes that little kid again, with his bag of rocks. Finally, the guy said, "That's enough. Please don't bring any more rocks." Sand glitters in the sun, but in New York, it's the sidewalks that glitter, with bits of broken glass in the asphalt. Even the streets in New York are paved with gold, they say. On television there was the music program called Iltatähti, Evening Star in English, that showed the very first of the music videos. As special effects, the bands used psychedelic swirling colored water and oil that they superimposed on the background or on the artists themselves. It was all elastic pictures to elastic rock and roll. We had a black and white television, so the trippy LSD psychedelia was even more nonsensical. I thought our television was broken. My brother Joan went nuts over the saxophone when he saw the Norwegian sax player Jan Garbarek live at the Tapiola Disco sometime in 1971. I was 8 and my bro was 16. He bought a sax immediately and practiced it like a maniac. I noticed how hard he practiced and realized that blowing that horn for 10 hours a day was his escape from anxiety. I got used to doing my homework and falling asleep to the sound of that sax. It was cool to see how serious my brother got into it. Joan would also test me at times. He'd clap out a rhythm sequence and ask me to clap after him. 3, 1, pause, 2, pause, 4, and so on. When he played his records, he asked me to tell him what I heard. My ear always zeroed in on the bass line. At 8 or 9, I built a drone bass from the coils of a table lamp. I stretched the coils on a piece of board with nails and taped the mic underneath. For the amp, I used a reel-to-reel tape recorder we had at home. I strummed the lamp coils for hours on end and was in some kind of a trance zone. It was an even, percussive, rough space hum that sounded like the drone of a sitar, only on a very low bass frequency. I fought pretty frequently with my sis, Marit, until we made a deal on the bike trip that the fighting had to stop. After that, we never fought again, period. My sister had started playing the guitar and taught me how to play a Howlin' Wolf spoonful with one finger. Just 2 notes. There's a third one too, but you can leave it out, so it's really just 2 notes. Getting the rhythm right was the main thing. My sister was hanging out with a gang of 20 or so hippies. Out of all of them, only my sister and one other guy are still alive. They'd hang out in Silkkineet Park, in their hippie gear, smoking weed, dropping acid and taking whatever else they could get their hands on. Whenever our parents were away, there'd be big parties at our house. Incense burning, people nodding off, and murky music playing. They tried to get me to go to bed early, but it never worked because I was too intent on being the center of attention, perched on the knee of a pretty girl taking drags of a cigarette. Dad worked like a dog, and when he was home his presence was palpable. He was unpredictable. You'd never know when or what would make him lose it. Usually he was okay, and there were moments of calm too. I had a chronic stomach pains from the ages of 7 to 10 or so, due to the tension and fighting in the house. Headphones were my escape. When the storm started to gather, I'd pull them over my ears and crank them up. Dad had given me Rolling Stones' Beggar's Banquet album as a present, which is still my favorite Stones record. It's mostly an acoustic album where Keith Richards does the bulk of the guitar playing. Street Fighting Man, Sympathy for the Devil, Dear Doctor, No Expectations. Jagger sounds like he's from Mississippi, not from Dartford, England. In the 60s and 70s, most of the English singers wanted to sound American. I escaped from the world's bullshit through music and reading. Some books are now mentally linked to music. IRA, Belfast, The Troubles, and all that insanity on the television felt so close in the 70s. I read a lot of books about the IRA and Vietnam War in the 70s and 80s. My memory of the first Stiff Little Fingers record is paired with this one book. I can't remember the title, about the IRA. Iggy Pop's The Idiot album is etched in my mind with a book called Chicken Hawk, about the Vietnam War. Mom had been a stay-at-home mom until she went to work at the Children's Hospital, and after that at RAY, Finland's Slot Machine Association. That's when the good times began. I got to buy singles discarded from jukeboxes, 10 cents a pop. Alice Cooper, Sweet, Slade, Suzi Quatro, David Bowie, Rory Gallagher, Sparks, Beatles, Stones, Hendrix, you name it. I played those 45s on our Lenko record player non-stop. The Stones were always badass, but so were the Beatles in their Beatles way, with Back in the USSR, Get Back, Penny Lane, Eleanor Rigby. Paul McCartney would have made history just for his bass lines. But my first love that was all mine was Alice Cooper, Sweet, and Slade. My brother and sister absolutely hated them. Do we really have to hear School's Out for the 1000th time? One and the only rock and roll music program that was on the radio once a week played the New York Dolls' first album in its entirety. I recorded it on a cassette. The other side was Bowie's Diamond Dogs. There had been a tiny color picture of the Dolls in a music magazine, which mesmerized me. Holy shit! I could just stare at it and stare at it like, holy mama, what a fucking crew. All of a sudden, Sweet didn't seem so tough. Music lessons at school were a drag. We were made to listen to classical music and learn about long-dead composers. Rock and roll wasn't culture, so it wasn't part of the curriculum. My brother dressed up good, a neck scarf, tight pants, and hair down to his ass. He'd gotten his hands on a Harlem slang dictionary. I flipped through the book trying to think of what I wanted to know. Well, How about what's the slang for Jesus in that city of Harlem, New York?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?